My name's Camilla, and I'm 30 years old. I live in a cozy house, a place full of memories, left to me by my dear grandmother. It's been my sanctuary, my little world, where everything just feels right. But, as life would have it, not everything outside these walls is as peaceful. You see, my family is a bit of a mixed bag. There's my husband John, a man of few words, who always seems to be caught in the middle of things. We've had our ups and downs, but who doesn't, right? Then there's my father-in-law, Robert. He was a gem, the kind of man who could light up a room with his smile. I always wondered how he ended up with Helen, my mother-in-law. To put it nicely, Helen is difficult. And that's me being polite. And let's not forget Lucy, John's sister. She lives nearby with her husband and kids in a rented apartment. Lucy and I never really clicked. Maybe it's because she's so much like Helen. I remember this one evening, a typical family dinner at our place. Robert was there, and as usual, he was the life of the party. "Camilla, this lasagna is divine," Robert said with a grin, taking another hearty bite. "Thank you, Robert. It's Grandma's recipe," I replied with a smile. Helen, on the other hand, barely touched her food. She just pushed it around her plate, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "It's a bit too salty, don't you think?" she said, her voice sharp. John shot me an apologetic glance across the table. I just shrugged it off. "That's Helen for you, always a critic." Lucy chimed in. "Mom, it's fine. Not everyone has your taste buds." The conversation moved on, but the tension lingered, as it always did when Helen was around. After dinner, Robert pulled me aside. "Camilla, I just want to say I really appreciate how you handle Helen. You have the patience of a saint." I laughed. "Well, I try, Robert, but it's not easy." He patted my shoulder. "You're doing great, dear. Just hang in there." If only I knew then how much more hanging in there I'd have to do. That's the thing about life in our little family. You never know what's coming next, especially with Helen and Lucy in the mix. But back then, it was just the usual. A little bit of discomfort, a lot of biting my tongue and trying to keep the peace. Little did I know, the storm was just around the corner. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. And one of those came crashing into our lives one cold, dreary morning. Robert, the one person who brought some light into our often tense family gatherings, passed away. It was sudden, a heart attack, they said. He was the glue that held us all together, and without him, things started to unravel quickly. The day after we got the news, I found myself in our kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, lost in thought. John walked in, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. "He was the best dad anyone could ask for," John said, his voice heavy with sadness. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "I know, honey. He was wonderful. We're going to miss him so much." John nodded, wiping away a tear. "Mom's taking it hard. She's a mess." That wasn't hard to imagine. Helen without Robert was like a ship without a rudder, lost and directionless. And true to form, she became more difficult than ever. Every phone call with her was like walking on eggshells. A week later, we were at Helen's house. Lucy was there too, her eyes red from crying. The air was thick with grief and unspoken tension. "We need to talk about what's next for Mom," Lucy said, breaking the uneasy silence. John sighed. "Yeah, we do. She can't be alone in that big house. She needs someone around, just in case." Helen's gaze shifted to me, her eyes narrowing. "I don't want strangers in my house. What about Camilla? She's home most of the time." I felt my heart sink. This was not what I had signed up for. "Helen, maybe you could stay with Lucy. She's got more space, and the kids would love to have you around." But Helen shook her head, her lips a thin line. "Lucy's place is always so noisy, and I can't stay in this house filled with memories of Robert." The conversation went around in circles, with no one willing to back down. Lucy seemed relieved at the thought of not having her mother move in with her. John looked torn between his mother and me, not sure which side to take. We left Helen's house that day with no resolution in sight. I could feel the storm clouds gathering, a sense of dread settling over me. How were we going to navigate this? How was I going to deal with Helen under my own roof, in the house that was once my sanctuary? As we drove home, John reached for my hand. "We'll figure this out, Camilla. Together, we will defend our independence." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But deep down, I knew things were about to get a whole lot more complicated. The air was tense when we all gathered again at Helen's house. The living room felt smaller than usual, crowded with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Lucy was there, fidgeting nervously, while her husband Mark tried to look anywhere but at Helen. John and I sat on the edge of our seats, bracing for whatever was coming. "So, have we decided what to do about Mom?" Lucy finally broke the silence. Helen, who had been staring out the window, turned sharply. "I've made up my mind," she declared. "I'm giving this house to you, Lucy, and I'm moving in with Camilla and John." My jaw dropped. "What? Helen, we didn't discuss this." Lucy's face lit up, a stark contrast to the shock on mine. "Really, Mom? That would be great." John looked at me and tried to intervene. "Mom, we need to talk about this. It's not that simple." Helen's eyes narrowed. "What's there to talk about? Camilla has plenty of space, and she works from home. It's settled." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Helen, this is a big decision. And what about Lucy? She has more room, and the kids—" Helen cut me off. "Lucy's house is always in chaos with those children. I need peace and quiet." John gave me a helpless look, clearly torn. "Camilla, maybe we can make it work. For a while, at least." So Helen hasn't changed her mind since our last meeting. I felt my frustration mounting. "John, we can't just rearrange our lives because Helen decides so. What about our privacy? Our life?" Lucy chimed in, her voice a little too eager and triumphantly. "Camilla, think about it. Mom needs us now. You wouldn't want her to be alone, would you?" I felt like I was being cornered, my own home slipping away from me. "It's not about that, Lucy. It's about making a decision that affects all of us. We need to think this through." But it was clear that Helen had made up her mind, and Lucy was all too happy to support her decision. John turned out to be too soft, not independent, to make a decision in our favor. As we left Helen's house that day, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I was about to lose the one place where I had always felt safe and at peace, my sanctuary, and there was nothing I could do about it. The days following that dreaded meeting were some of the longest in my life. I tried to argue with John, to make him see reason, but it was like talking to a brick wall. "Camilla, she's my mother. What do you want me to do? Turn her away?" It wasn't that I wanted to turn Helen away. I just wanted a say in what happened in my own home. But it seemed like my say didn't count for much. Before I knew it, the day came when Helen moved in. She arrived with more luggage than I thought possible for one person. My once serene living room was now cluttered with her things. "I hope you don't mind, Camilla. I need all my things around me," Helen said, directing the movers here and there. I forced a smile, hiding my frustration. "Of course, Helen. Make yourself at home." As the days turned into weeks, my patience wore thin. Helen had a way of making her presence felt in every corner of the house. She criticized my cooking, my cleaning, even the way I arranged the living room furniture. One evening, as I was trying to make dinner, Helen came into the kitchen. "You're cutting the carrots all wrong. Here, let me show you how it's done." I bit my tongue, handing her the knife. "Sure, Helen, show me." John walked in just then, and I could see he was trying to gauge the situation. "Everything okay here?" "Just teaching Camilla a thing or two about cooking," Helen said, a hint of smugness in her voice. I kept quiet, focusing on the onions I was chopping. John lingered for a moment, an awkward spectator, before mumbling something about checking the mail and leaving the kitchen. It wasn't just the constant criticism that got to me. It was the way Helen managed to turn John against me. Every time I tried to talk to him about how I felt, he accused me of being insensitive. "Camilla, she's going through a tough time. Can't you just cut her some slack?" John would say. I felt like I was losing not just my home, but my husband too. Then came the day when Helen decided she didn't like the color of the living room walls. "They're too dull. We need something brighter." I found myself reluctantly agreeing to repaint the room, just to keep the peace. As I watched the painters covering my once favorite shade of blue with a garish yellow that Helen had picked, I realized how much of my life I was giving up. My home didn't feel like mine anymore, and I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. Living with Helen was like being on a never-ending roller coaster, except there were no thrilling moments, just a constant churning in the pit of my stomach. She had a complaint for everything. The food wasn't to her taste, the house wasn't clean enough, and the TV was never on the channel she liked. One evening, as I was trying to finish up some work on my laptop, Helen barged into the room, the TV remote in her hand. "Camilla, this TV is driving me nuts. I can't find my show." I sighed, closing my laptop. "Let me help you, Helen." As I flipped through the channels, trying to find her show, Helen muttered under her breath about how everything was better at her house. John walked in at that moment, and I looked up at him, hoping for some support. "John, can you please help your mother with the TV? I'm trying to finish my work." John frowned, looking from me to Helen. "Can't you see she's struggling, Camilla? It's just a TV show." I felt a surge of frustration. "It's not just about the TV, John. It's about having a little space to do my work, to have a moment of peace in my own house." Helen looked at John, her eyes welling up. "I didn't mean to be a burden. I just wanted to watch my show." John's expression softened as he turned to his mother. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll find your show." I watched as John took the remote from me and started channel surfing, trying to appease Helen. I felt invisible, unheard. The next day, Lucy dropped by with her kids. The house was chaotic, with the kids running around and Helen trying to dictate how to entertain them. I retreated to the kitchen to prepare some snacks, feeling overwhelmed. Lucy followed me into the kitchen, a smirk on her face. "Looks like Mom's really settled in, huh?" I didn't even try to mask my irritation. "It's a lot, Lucy. It's not easy having your entire home life turned upside down." Lucy shrugged, unconcerned. "Well, she's family. You just have to deal with it." That evening, as we all sat down for dinner, the tension was palpable. Helen criticized the pasta I made. John was silent, and Lucy's kids were restless. I finally snapped. "I can't do this anymore. I need some space, some respect in my own home." Helen gasped, and John shot me a look of disbelief. "Camilla, how can you be so selfish?" I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Selfish? I've been nothing but accommodating. This is my home too, John." The argument escalated, voices raised, words flying like daggers. John stormed out of the room, and Helen sat there, looking smug. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of the TV from the living room where Helen slept, I realized something had to change. I couldn't live like this anymore. But how was I going to make John see that? How was I going to reclaim my life? The days after the big argument were filled with a tense silence. John and I barely spoke, and Helen acted like she owned the place, more so than ever. I felt like a stranger in my own home, tiptoeing around to avoid any confrontations. But the universe seemed to have other plans for me. One day, I came home early from the grocery store. The house was unusually quiet. As I was putting away the groceries, I heard hushed voices coming from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I tiptoed closer. It was Helen and Lucy, deep in conversation. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard what they were saying. "And now I don't have to deal with yours noisy kids all day," Helen was saying with a chuckle. Moving in with Camilla and John was the best decision. Camilla does everything around the house, and I have all the peace I want. Lucy's voice was equally gleeful. "And I get Dad's house without paying a dime. It worked out perfectly for us." My hands were shaking, and I felt a surge of anger like never before. They had been playing us all along. This wasn't about family or taking care of each other. It was a cold, calculated move. I stormed into the living room, my voice shaking with anger. "I heard everything. How could you, Helen? And you, Lucy?" Helen looked up, startled. Then her expression turned into one of defiance. "What are you talking about, Camilla? We were just chatting." Lucy tried to play innocent. "Yeah, Camilla, you must have misunderstood." But I was done being the understanding, accommodating daughter-in-law. "No, I heard you both. You've been using us, manipulating the situation for your benefit." Helen's face hardened. "You have no right to speak to me like that. I am your elder, and you should respect me." John walked in at that moment, confused. "What's going on here?" I turned to him, my eyes welling up with tears of frustration. "John, they've been using us. Your mother and sister planned all this just so they could get what they wanted." John looked from me to Helen and Lucy, his expression one of disbelief. "Is this true, Mom?" Helen started to cry, playing the victim. "She's lying, John. I would never do such a thing." John seemed torn, unsure of whom to believe. I could see the doubt in his eyes, and it broke my heart. He still didn't trust me, even after everything. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I knew things couldn't go on like this. I had to take a stand for my own sanity. The next day, I was going to have a serious talk with John. It was time to put an end to this charade, one way or another. That morning, I knew it was time for a frank conversation with John. The house was quiet, the tension from the previous night still lingering in the air. I waited in the kitchen, my thoughts racing, until John finally walked in, his face a mask of worry. "John, we need to talk about everything that's happening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He poured himself a coffee and sat down, looking exhausted. "Camilla, I just don't know what to think anymore." "Think about us, John. Your mother and sister are tearing us apart," I urged. Before we could delve deeper, Helen walked in, her timing too perfect. "John, are you going to let her speak about your family like that?" The conversation quickly heated up. I tried to explain, to make him see the truth, but Helen's presence was like a fuse, igniting John's temper. "You're being unreasonable, Camilla. How can you be so heartless towards my mother?" John's voice rose with each word. Frustrated and desperate, I shot back, "Heartless? I'm trying to save our home, our marriage." In the heat of the moment, Helen clutched her chest dramatically, gasping, "My heart? How can you do this to me?" John spun around, his anger flaring. "Look what you're doing to her, Camilla!" And then, in a flash of fury, John's hand struck my face. The shock of it silenced the room. Helen stood there, a triumphant grin barely hidden. I touched my lip, feeling the sting of the slap and the flowing blood, and the reality of what just happened hit me. My husband had chosen his manipulative mother over me, our marriage. Without a word, I picked up the phone and called the police. As I waited for them, I began to pack Helen's and John's belongings, methodically, my movements fueled by a mix of hurt and determination. John tried to apologize, his anger now replaced with anxiety. "Camilla, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." But it was too late. "I'm filing for divorce, John. I can't be in a marriage where I'm not respected, where I'm not safe." The police arrived, and I explained everything. John and Helen were quiet, the reality of their situation finally dawning on them. After the police left, I dragged the suitcases to the front door. Helen's face was a picture of shock as I placed them outside. "This is your stuff. You need to leave now," I said, my voice void of any emotion. John picked up the suitcases, his eyes avoiding mine. Helen wanted to scold me again, but then followed him, her triumphant act gone, replaced by a dawning realization of what she had lost. As the door closed behind them, the silence of the house enveloped me. It was a painful moment, but also one of clarity. I had stood up for myself, chosen my dignity over a broken marriage. Now, it was time to rebuild my life on my own terms, in my own home. After the divorce was finalized, I found myself in a quiet, almost surreal calm. My house, once a battleground of tension and conflict, was now solely mine again. I spent the first few days just walking through the rooms, taking in the emptiness, the peace that had returned. It felt like waking up from a long, troubled dream. I started by returning the house to its former appearance, undoing the changes Helen had imposed. Each shift, each movement, felt like a step towards reclaiming my life. The walls were repainted back to the soothing blue I loved, the furniture rearranged to the way it used to be. With each change, a sense of normalcy and tranquility returned. My new routine was simple but fulfilling. Mornings were spent in the garden, tending to the flowers that had been neglected, and evenings were for reading books in the quiet of my living room. The house, with all its memories, began to feel like a home again. One afternoon, while pruning the roses, my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, called out from over the fence. "Camilla, dear, I heard about your divorce. I'm so sorry." I smiled at her, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. It's been tough, but I'm getting there." She leaned in closer, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. "You know, I hear things haven't been so peaceful at Helen's place either. The whole neighborhood knows about their squabbles. The police had been called there a few times already. I wasn't surprised. Helen, John, Lucy, her husband, and their kids all under one roof was a recipe for constant chaos. I can imagine. Too many conflicting personalities in one space. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. You're better off without that drama, dear. You always were too good for them. I laughed, the sound light and free. I'm starting to realize that now. Days turned into weeks, and I began to rediscover parts of myself that I had lost in the turmoil of my marriage. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. The strokes of the brush on the canvas were like whispers of a newfound freedom. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets of the ongoing drama at Helen's house. It was a stark reminder of the bullet I had dodged. Their house, once a symbol of familial unity, had become a pressure cooker of arguments and disagreements. In those moments, I felt a twinge of sadness for John, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of relief. I had escaped that life, that endless cycle of unhappiness. I was free to live on my terms, to find happiness in the little things, my garden, my art, my peaceful home. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset, I realized that this was a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I was the author, free to write my story, one day at a time. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty was exciting, filled with possibilities. I was ready to face whatever came next, on my own terms, in my own way.